Why did Russia beg America to buy Alaska? Why did the Americans pay $1.5 million more than Russia asked for? We will also recall how the Russian world came to Alaska, how Russians raped, took hostages, tortured, spread diseases, created artificial famine, enslaved people, and thus destroyed more than 80% of the indigenous Alaskan population. Let us talk about where the Aleuts can live well, in Kamchatka or in Alaska. Welcome to Sergei Lubarsky's YouTube channel. Russian propaganda often dwells on a sort of half-myth, half-legend. The Americans supposedly snatched Alaska from us, bought it for pennies, and really we should think about whose Alaska it is. And today we have the history lesson that was never taught in Soviet or Russian schools, the history of Alaska. Officials such as Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and former president, declared in January 2024 that Russia expects the return of Alaska any day now. This statement stirred up a huge wave of nationalist rhetoric in Russia around the topic of Alaska and was greeted with enthusiasm. Vyacheslav Volodin, the Speaker of the State Duma, warned in July 2022 that Moscow might lay claim to Alaska if Washington continued to assist Ukraine or froze Russian assets abroad. And a certain Oleg Matveyev, a deputy and political strategist, became downright famous during Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 when he publicly demanded that the United States return Alaska and Fort Ross, which we will also talk about today, in California as a bonus. In 1741, the Bering and Chirikov expedition reached the coast of Alaska, the first discovery of Alaska by the Russians. From that point on, the Promyshleniki, those who traded in fur, began to visit Alaska. Although Alaska had not been officially annexed by the Russian Empire, Russian Promyshleniki, essentially bandits and pirates, nevertheless began hunting the local population and the local wildlife. In 1784, Shelikov founded the first permanent trading post on Kodiak Island. In 1799, the Russian-American Company was established, which held a monopoly on the colonization of Alaska. It must be said that at that time it was not called Alaska, it was called Russian America. Accordingly, it was not an Alaskan company, but the Russian-American Company. And in 1867, Alaska was sold. So, from 1799, the official founding of the Russian-American Company, until 1867 for 68 years, Alaska was under Russian protectorate. What were the American indigenous peoples like in the period from 1740 to 1760? There were more than 10 tribes speaking different languages, and at varying levels of cultural development. Most of them hunted at sea. They were hunters and gatherers, a tribal clan society, a primitive communal system. They naturally knew nothing of slavery, had no writing, no bronze, and used stone tools. And the population amounted to about 80, by some estimates 100,000 people. This includes all of Alaska together with the nearby islands. What was the population of the arriving colonists? At the peak of Alaska's Russian period, sometime in the 1830s, the maximum number of Russians from Russia, not counting people of mixed ancestry, was 780. 780 people subdued at least 80,000. Those were the proportions. Naturally, contact with European civilization came at a tremendous cost for the Aleuts and the other dozens of peoples. Disease, a huge number of viral and bacterial infections, including measles and smallpox, spread among them. As a result of these diseases, and later of the famine created by the Russians, because the Russians destroyed almost all sources of food and killed nearly everything that swam or moved, we will talk about this a bit later, famine began. As a result of that famine, bacterial infections, a collapse of the immune system, and so on, about 80% of the local population perished. Fewer than 15,000 remained. There was also an enormous number of raped women. Thus, by the time America began to colonize Alaska, Around 20% of the population were first or second generation people of mixed ancestry, the children or grandchildren of women who had been raped by Russian soldiers, Russian colonists, and so on. Of course, there were marriages, there were legitimate children born in those marriages, and yes, locals were baptized. But originally, especially in the first half of colonization, the local population, particularly the girls and women, were considered quite attractive, and they were mercilessly subjected to rape. And, interestingly, there was a practice of harems. Military chiefs and Cossacks often kept several concubines. Women they took turns with, such practices existed here. But all of that was nothing compared with the practice known here as amanatstvo. Amanat means hostage. I do not know the origin of the word, but it refers to a hostage, usually a child of a clan leader, since this was a clan-based society, who would be killed or tortured if the tribe failed to deliver a required number of fur pelts. Instead of hunting themselves, which was difficult, time-consuming, and dangerous in these waters, the colonizers devised an excellent way to obtain tribute from the local population: the amanat. We take hostages until you bring us what we demand. This was ordinary protection racketeering, something very familiar in the 1990s. If the Russian world excelled at racketeering in the 1990s, a soldering iron where it hurts until you pay, then, forgive me, 200 years earlier, in the era of serfdom that existed throughout Mother Russia, it was practically divinely ordained, and no one here felt the slightest shame about it. Very quickly, this amanat system evolved, and almost the entire local population became slaves who had to pay regular tribute. And if you did not bring it, you were either killed, tortured, or flogged. That is how the local population began working for the white colonists. In reality, everything I'm describing is in no way different from what happened to the indigenous peoples of Siberia under similar circumstances. For example, the Tungus and the Yakuts. Up to 80% of their population was wiped out, mainly because of famine and smallpox. On Kamchatka, there were 150,000 indigenous inhabitants, the Itelmens, the Koryaks, and only 10,000 remained. That is a destruction rate of 93%. The Yakuts suffered a 70% loss, mainly due to smallpox, famine, and colonial violence. The Kamchadals lost 90% of their people. That is 90% destruction. The Vakals lost 50%. 12 peoples with populations of 100,000 or more were completely exterminated. We do not even know their names. This was the result of the Russian world's colonization of these tribes. So when you, gentlemen, ask me about the cruelties committed by American settlers, which I will soon tell you about, let us begin with the cruelties committed by Russian settlers. Forget about Siberia, Mother Russia. Here in America, they were absolutely no less and often far more brutal toward the indigenous population. The question arises, did the local population resist? Yes, of course. There were constant conflicts, constant clashes, and people died on both sides. And the most interesting events unfolded in the early 1800s, in the year 1802, when the local Tlingit tribe, that was the name of the tribe, suddenly attacked the Mikhailovskaya fortress. Today, the city of Sitka stands on that spot. They killed nearly all the inhabitants of the fortress, of whom there were 40, and accordingly, 2 years later, a certain Alexander Baranov organized a punitive expedition. In early October, exactly 2 years later, in 1804, an armed ship, the Neva, under the command of Lieutenant Yuli Lisiansky, arrived at the settlement that was later named New Archangel. There were also several coastal vessels carrying Cossacks, as well as armed Promyshleniki. This entire force carried out a landing and an assault on the fortress. To their surprise, the local population repelled the attack. The battle lasted 7 days. There was a siege, and the fortress, which had passed into the hands of the local people, was shelled with the Neva's cannons. Both sides suffered losses, and on the 7th of October, the indigenous fighters simply left the fortress without engaging in further direct combat. After that, the place was renamed New Archangel, and the capital of Alaska was moved there. Today, this city is Sitka. It was in this very city that the American flag was raised when Alaska passed from Russian to American hands. What was the geographical scope of this colonization? There were only about a dozen settlements in total. Settlements that had a church, meaning they could at least somewhat be called villages or tiny towns, numbered only 4. Namely, the already mentioned New Archangel, today's Sitka, where at most 250 people lived. That was the maximum. Pavlovskaya, now Kodiak Island in Alaska, had 150 people. Unalashka in the Aleutian Islands had 100 people, and that was it. In addition to this, there was Fort Ross, which I will talk about a bit later, located right here near me. At its maximum, it held up to 60 people, plus 80 people of mixed ancestry and baptized Aleuts who had been brought there, and there was also Fort Elizabeth in Hawaii, where a Russian garrison of 40 soldiers was stationed. There were also a few small outposts and trading stations where 5, 6, or 10 people lived, mostly Cossacks and these tax collectors, these fur tribute gatherers. Altogether, in the 1830s, the total came to around 800. In fact, according to the census, 788 people. That was the entire Russian presence here. How was this Russian-American company organized? It was a very interesting business, a monopoly. The idea was that this fur, mainly from northern fur seals, was extremely valuable in China. Strangely enough. Why? Because the number of follicles from which each hair grows on 1 square inch, 2.5 by 2.5 centimeters, is about 4,000. In other words, a very soft and very dense fur that also repels water. This fur was extremely valuable. In addition, there were fox furs, bear furs, and all kinds of other pelts, and all this fur was obtained in Alaska and transported to China. I will explain in a moment how, why, and for how much. After that, in China, they took silks, porcelain, and other expensive Chinese goods and carried them back to Russia. The trade cycle was arranged in quite an interesting way. From Alaska, from its various towns such as Sitka and Kodiak, goods were shipped to Okhotsk on coastal vessels built right here on the Pacific, this very fur. The journey took from 1.5 to 3 months depending on the weather. Then from Okhotsk to Yakutsk, then to Irkutsk, and then to Kyakhta, which is in today's Buryatia. All of this travel was overland, and it took from 3 to 4 months depending on the season. Thus, by the time the fur reached Kyakhta, 5 to 7 months had passed. Kyakhta was the border town between China and the Russian Empire. There the goods brought from Alaska were exchanged for Chinese products. China, as always, exported. And these Chinese exports then traveled overland through Siberia in caravans, packed into bales to St. Petersburg. This took another 6 months. So altogether about a year, slightly more than a year, passed before the goods traveled to China for exchange and reached St. Petersburg. This is what the company lived on. There were 2 ways to reach these regions by sea. The first way was around Africa and through the Indian and then the Pacific Ocean. But this was practically impossible because of piracy in the Indian Ocean, in the region of the Yellow Sea, the Sea of Japan, and so on. These areas were impassable for non-military vessels, and sending a naval squadron was practically impossible. The other route, around the southern tip of America, then across the Pacific and up the American coast to Alaska, went against the currents. The storms were strong, the weather severe, and it was all upstream. In other words, under any circumstances, sea routes for communication with Alaska were so expensive that they were practically impossible. Theoretically possible, practically impossible. Therefore, all trade, all the results of this plundering, essentially it was plundering of the local population, went overland through Siberia along the route I described, and this instantly created a problem for the owners of the company: how to feed, maintain, and produce the necessary goods to expand this colony. Transporting goods over land was very expensive, and transporting them by sea in the opposite direction was practically impossible. So a decision was made to produce food and to build ships, to produce leather, goods, metal, metallurgy, and so on, right there on the spot. But there was one problem. Nothing could be grown in Alaska. It was too cold, grains did not ripen. There was also no way to build ships there. And so a decision was made to move down along California, almost as far as San Francisco, right where I live now, and to establish a Russian colony called Fort Ross. Its task was to grow grains, which worked, to produce leather and leather goods, to carry out metallurgy and iron production, and also to trade with Spaniards, Mexicans, and Americans who had begun arriving in the region. All the necessary goods from San Francisco were sent north to Alaska by this Russian company. Why am I telling you all this? Because it was a very expensive and unprofitable business. Only the extremely high price of fur made this business reliable. That is, 6 vessels were built here in California at Fort Ross. These were schooners and small boats. Their names are known. Large ocean-going ships could not be built because there was no rigging, but the presence of excellent forests, redwoods and other species that grow here in California, these very wooded places made it possible to create a supply base here in the San Francisco area. The locals were baptized, indigenous women appeared, and mixed heritage children appeared as well. The total population of Fort Ross did not exceed 60 ethnic Russians, plus a certain number of mixed heritage people, the children of Aleut women, who had been brought from the north. It is Fort Ross that is connected with the story of Juno and Avos. It was on the ship Juno that the administrator of the entire company, Count Rezanov, arrived from Alaska. Yes, the story is absolutely true. He negotiated with the local mayor. At that time, San Francisco had a different name, Yerba Buena. He negotiated with the local administrator, Bojro Bobieno. The town itself had fewer than 200 people. That is, San Francisco was a settlement of 200 people. It was part of the Spanish colony. There was not yet a Mexican crown. The negotiations concerned the supply of essential goods, food and provisions to Alaska. And yes, he fell in love with a young girl there. And yes, he died on the way as he hurried to obtain his parents' blessing, since she was Catholic. The entire story is true, and he was precisely the entrepreneur who genuinely tried to establish economically viable production, an economically viable business, with Alaska. After his death, there was practically no administrator of comparable competence here, and the business quickly withered. This Russian fort is in excellent condition. There is a museum now. You can go inside. The cemetery has been preserved, as have the barracks, the walls, the pier, the church, and of course the blacksmith shop. Everything that once existed there has been preserved beautifully, strangely enough. Moreover, a few years ago, a Russian oligarch donated several $1 million to build a mill. The mill was made in Russia, brought here, ceremonially opened, and gifted to this historic site. I do not know whether Russian forts of that period have been preserved in Russia, but here everything stands in place, including the cannons, and festivals of Russian culture are held there. The area is stunningly beautiful. Steep hills, nearly mountains, very wooded, incredibly picturesque. Today, it is a recreation and winemaking region known as the Russian River No. Under the Russians, it was called the Slavyanka River, but the Spaniards called it Riva Russo, and therefore the Americans who came later named it, according to the Spanish model, the Russian River. So there is the Russian River. Excellent grapes grow there, and it is about 2 hours by car north of San Francisco along the Pacific coast. Wonderfully beautiful and interesting places. What is interesting is that a similar project existed in Hawaii. A little-known detail. There is a book I read long ago where I first learned about it called The Russian Flag over Hawaii. And so, at the beginning of 1817, the author of the project was a certain Georgy Antonovich Schaffer, who arrived in Hawaii, bribed the local chief Komuali'i, and on the island of Kauai built a military fort, the so-called Fort Elizabeth. It had stone walls, I'm not joking, stone walls up to 7 meters high and from 25 to 45 inches thick, that is 1.5 meters or more. The goal was the same, to establish shipbuilding and the production of goods and food for this company. But it all ended quickly. It ended quickly because, for the same reason as elsewhere, the locals were used as slaves. The local population immediately rebelled, the contract was immediately terminated, and the fort did not survive for more than a year. And accordingly, some interesting questions arise. Why did such a wonderful enterprise end so quickly? Here before you is a graph showing by decade the profitability of this Russian-American company in thousands of Russian dollars. At its peak, in its very best period, the company brought in about $200,000 a year. Starting from 1810, exactly when Fort Ross was founded, profitability dropped sharply, and by 1856 the company had become unprofitable, meaning that money had to be spent simply to keep it afloat. The question arises, why? There are several answers. The first and main one is overhunting. The Russians on Alaska, especially on the Aleutian Islands and the southern coast of Alaska, destroyed all wildlife. They destroyed it so completely that nothing was left, which naturally caused famine among the local population. They had lived on these animals before. This is the first, but not the only, reason. The second reason is competition with Canadian and American fur traders, who were far more efficient despite not using slave labor, and who began supplying fur to China at much more favorable prices. In other words, prices fell, demand stayed the same, supply increased, and prices dropped. The third, no less important reason was that starting in the 1850s, British squadrons began patrolling the northern Pacific Ocean, right there, where the route from Alaska to Okhotsk ran, stopping those coastal trading boats and sinking them. In other words, the British, perfidious Albion, being perfidious, had started causing trouble. The combination of these three factors, plus the very high, always very high cost of maintaining those colonies, made fur extraction in that region completely impossible. And so it became absolutely unnecessary to anyone, a useless enterprise, and I should add in parentheses that it was extremely mismanaged. That is, posts were assigned for bribes, massive corruption flourished, and the goods delivered were of poor quality because procurement was done through bribes. In short, a typical Russian story. By the beginning of the Crimean War, this colony had already become a burden rather than a profitable enterprise. Well, the question arises, all right, the land is unprofitable. Let it be, it doesn't really ask for anything. Yes, there are about 200 to 300 Russian people living there, somehow surviving. Some Aleuts and other Chechmayaks lived there as well. So why sell it? Why was it so urgently necessary to sell it in a rush? The answer is that the Russian government, the Tsar, feared that the British would seize Russia's Pacific coast, Kamchatka, and further south toward China. And this danger became clearly visible during the Crimean War, when Russia, Britain, and France were at war with one another. That is, France, Britain, and Turkey against Russia. Britain and France were trying to halt Russia's colonial ambitions, to seize the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, to take Iran, and to take part of China. That was what the war in Crimea was about. It had already become a global conflict. Therefore, there was a Franco-British flotilla that in the early and mid-50s began sinking ships, Russian ships, those small coastal trading boats that sailed along the shoreline, carrying goods from Alaska to Okhotsk Bay. Moreover, in August of 1854, and this alarmed the Tsarist government greatly, a flotilla approached the Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky Bay. 6 warships, French and British, more than 2,000 men landing parties were deployed. and there was a battle that lasted several weeks. The Russians repelled the bombardments from the naval guns and did not allow Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky to be taken. About 1,000 people were killed on both sides, including sailors, Cossacks, and local inhabitants. In other words, this was a real attempt to seize Kamchatka, and then, using it as a forward base, continue the offensive and take Russia's Pacific coast. You may ask, what does Alaska have to do with this? Because Alaska, which was practically impossible to defend or maintain, could easily fall into British hands through Canada. Canada was part of the British Empire. For Canada to seize Alaska would have been quite simple. It was right next door in 1825 to 1826. A border was established that essentially still remains in place today, marking where Alaska ends and Canada begins. But it would have been very easy for the British to capture Alaska and, through Alaska, begin their expansion, their British expansion, onto Russia's Pacific coastline. Therefore, precisely in order to prevent this from happening, it was necessary to burn the bridge between America and Siberia. And that bridge was Alaska. Russia was hurriedly burning its bridges. This was a matter of geopolitics, not a matter of money. Alaska was no longer bringing in any money at all. It was a question of how to get rid of this political risk. Therefore, the initiator of this deal was Russia. Russia was practically begging America to buy this territory. The chief initiator by name was the emperor's brother, the brother of Emperor Alexander II, Grand Duke Constantine. It was his idea. He was responsible for this geopolitics. The price was essentially irrelevant. That is, something had to be received nominally, but Alaska needed to be transferred into America's hands because America and Great Britain had always been enemies. All those theories about the Anglo-Saxons who are always causing trouble are nonsense, pure conspiracy thinking. In reality, for most of their history, the British Empire and the American colonists were at odds. But that is another story. Let us not waste time on it now. Therefore, the best way to isolate Russia from a possible invasion through Alaska by the British Empire, yes, that is exactly what it was about, was to sell Alaska to America for any acceptable sum. And already in 1857, a request was made. A request was made through the Russian ambassador to the United States, Eduard Stoeckel, who in private conversations with Senator William Gwynn asked how much such a deal could be made for after consulting. Gwynn replied that the maximum that could be paid was $5 million. As a result, during the Crimean War, the Russians began preparing this deal in earnest. The Russian Empire was ready to dispose of Alaska during the Crimean War for any price whatsoever. And the only thing that prevented it from happening right then was the outbreak of the Civil War. America, as you can imagine, had no time for Russia's problems or for Alaska. Therefore, the deal that had been prepared in 1857 was postponed to 1867. It took America 10 years to agree to this deal. So in 1867, the Russian ambassador sought a way to reach the American Secretary of State, that is, the foreign minister. He bribed the politician and journalist Thurlow Weed, who for money introduced him to the Secretary of State, whose name was William Seward, and the Russians, explaining the situation, offered to sell this land for any acceptable price. On the 11th of March, 1867, the first meeting took place, at which the actual purchase was discussed. On the 15th of March, Seward proposed a sum of $5 to $5.5 million. Stoeckel insisted on $6 to $6.5 million. The bargaining began. On the 29th of March, 1969, as the document states, though clearly a dating error for 1867, Eduard Stoeckel received from St. Petersburg approval for the deal at the sum of $6 million, and he told his counterpart, the Secretary of State, "If you wish, tomorrow I will come to the department and we can begin signing the agreements." From the 29th to the 30th of March, everything was signed. On the 9th of April, 1867, the United States ratified the treaty. On the 15th of May, President Andrew Johnson signed it. And in October 1867, a ceremonial handover of the keys to Alaska took place, during which a captain of the Russian fleet lowered the Russian flag in Sitka, the very Sitka where not long before local Alayuts had been killed, and raised the American flag saying, "I transfer the territory of Alaska to the United States." A question arises: who deceived whom in this deal? Who profited? Who fooled whom? The first thing to discuss: I told you that the deal was for $6 million. Everyone knows it cost $7,200,000. So where, pardon me, did the rest of the money go? The answer is known. First, $165,000 were the bank's commission fees. For arranging the deal, banks always want to make money. $500,000 were paid out of those $6 million. That is, Russia was supposed to receive $6 million, but in reality received $5.5 million because the Russian government had debts. First, the debts were paid off. So as a result, after the debts were settled, the Russian treasury received $5.5 million. It still doesn't add up. Where did the remaining $1 million go? And another $1 million was distributed as bribes. Hence the very high bank commission. That is where the money was cashed out and handed out as bribes to 32 senators. Because no one in the American Senate had the slightest understanding of why such a foolish deal was needed. That is how much Russia wanted to sell Alaska to America, so much that it agreed to pay $1 million, practically 15% of the deal, as bribes to senators. At that time, American senators, as was customary, took bribes. I am not joking. That is how urgently they wanted to sell it. Why? There is a basic principle. Either you are selling or someone is buying from you. In this situation, Russia was the one selling, and America did not particularly want to buy. Moreover, this is what in America is called a business deal. When a store has burned down and some goods remain, signs go up. Final clearance. All prices final. Come and take whatever you can for whatever you can. That is exactly what was happening with Alaska. Alaska, which did not bring in a single kopeck of profit and was a dead asset because it was very far away, reaching it by ship was expensive, and crossing by land was impossible. It could not be supplied. It could not be fed. This colony was of no use to anyone, and it was a very good deal for the Russians. Yes, it was a very good deal for the Russians, for which the Russians paid $1 million in bribes here in America. There are rumors that the Secretary of State himself also enjoyed a generous slice of this deal. In other words, this was typical Russian stuff. Something was pushed onto someone for a bribe, so there should be no doubt about who was deceiving whom here. Let us compare it with other deals of this kind. America bought Louisiana. Louisiana was purchased for 4 cents per acre. Alaska was bought for 2 cents per acre. But, let's be honest, Louisiana is not Alaska. It is, a frontier, not some icy box in the middle of nowhere. Florida was bought practically for free. In reality, the United States simply paid off the Spanish government's debts related to Florida altogether. It came to about 10 cents per acre. So if Florida cost 10 cents per acre, and the swamps of Louisiana cost 4 cents per acre, then the glaciers of Alaska were worth nothing. And everyone understood this. Everyone clearly understood at the time that this was a deal made for a kickback. That very $1 million the Russians paid to local politicians in order to shove this chunk of ice onto them is what today would be called kickbacks. Therefore, America did not deceive anyone, except its own people. The newspaper New York Tribune called the deal reckless stupidity. The newspaper New York World on the 1st of April 1867. Russia sold us a squeezed-out orange. Russian America is a dreary wasteland of snow and ice. Russian America was the name for Alaska. This deal went around under the nickname Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, Kickbacks, or the Polar Bear Garden. That is what it was called back then. The entire American public was outraged by this purchase. Senator William Pitt Fessenden, one of the very few who did not take bribes, one of the 2 who did not vote for it, remarked sarcastically that he would be ready to support the treaty only on the condition that Seward and the president would go live in Alaska. Russia pushed Alaska onto the Americans by paying kickbacks. That is the part one must not forget. Before you is an article from a newspaper of the time, At the top of the paper is a cartoon, two men on a cart. One of them is President Andrew Johnson. The other is Secretary of State Seward, dragging a block of ice labeled Russian America. Everyone understood perfectly well that they were taking bribes. President Andrew Johnson was impeached half a year later, not for Alaska, but for other escapades. Nevertheless, this gives us a clear picture of what was happening. A corrupt government decided to make money on a completely unnecessary territory, making a foolish deal with Russia at a moment when America was emerging from its most terrible and bloody war, burdened with enormous debts. Spending $7,200,000 was absolutely out of place. What is $7,200,000 in today's terms? If calculated by the price of gold, depending on current market fluctuations, it amounts to something like $600 to $700 million. That is less than $1 billion in today's money. Probably less than 5% of what Russia spent on the Crimean War. So the sum was insignificant for Russia for America, whose economy at that time was much smaller than Russia's, with a population of 40 million and completely devastated by a brutal civil war. It was a huge amount for Russia. It was negligible. And how great was everyone's surprise when this foolish purchase, this foolish deal, paid off. It paid off extremely well, and already in 1896, 30 years later, the Klondike Gold Rush began. It continued in 1900 with the Nome and Fairbanks rushes, and that was the peak of gold extraction. Altogether, to this day, about $100 billion worth of gold has been taken out of Alaska. That is, having paid less than $1 billion in today's money, they have already extracted more than $100 billion in gold. Well, who could have known? Who could have known it would turn out that way? In addition, enormous reserves of oil and gas were discovered there. The oil reserves alone are estimated at roughly $300 billion, that is, known and proven reserves, assuming the price of a barrel is $80. And the annual oil extraction in Alaska amounts to $3 billion. Projects are being built for a liquefied gas pipeline, gas from northern Alaska down to the southern terminus, so that liquefied gas can be shipped out. So, without a doubt, this deal, which happened so foolishly, a chunk of ice practically shoved onto someone for a kickback, turned out to be a very profitable one. And this is something Russians are very sad about today. And so, today's Alaska is a completely unique state, the last American state, the 50th. It has many of its own peculiarities because of this very specific history. The first peculiarity, 61% of all Alaskan territory belongs to the federal government. The state government owns 21% of the land. The federal government transferred some territory to the state. 10% belongs to local tribes, and only 1% of the territory belongs to private owners. For America, this is a very strange situation. When 1% of the land is in private hands, usually everything is exactly the opposite. Accordingly, there is oil and gas there, and extraction companies pay Alaska royalties for production. This money is distributed as checks to local residents. It is enough to live in Alaska for more than 1 year and show that you intend to stay. Then you receive, according to the latest data from 2024, $1,700. The amount is not large, but it is per person a family. Mother, father, and me, 4 people multiplied by 1,700 is not bad. In addition, there is enough money to cover all the expenses of the state. Accordingly, in Alaska, there is no state income tax, which in California is, for the record, 11%. The population of Alaska is now about 800,000 people, one of the smallest states, and the average household income is about $110,000, a fairly high income level. Now let us compare Alaska with Kamchatka. The nature is almost the same. The population and the history are almost the same, I mean before the arrival of the Russians. So let us see who ended up luckier. The Aleuts, who remained living in Kamchatka, or the Aleuts, who remained living in Alaska. This is what Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky looks like today. You must agree. an unearthly kind of beauty. There stand Soviet five-story apartment blocks. They stand and stand. People live there comfortably. And this is what Anchorage looks like today. The population of Petropavlovsk is 100,000 Anchorage, 250,000. But that is not the point. And you might say to me, you have your architecture, we have our architecture. Why compare them? No, ladies and gentlemen. You should not compare the central part of a city, but the residential areas where people live in their own homes. This is what houses in Petropavlovsk look like, and this is what houses in Anchorage look like. Let us look once more. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. This is how ordinary people live, ordinary Russian people. And Anchorage, this is how ordinary American people live. Or take, for example, the port in Ust-Kamchatsk. This is what it looks like. And the port in Kodiak. This used to be a Russian settlement. This is what it looks like. I think that says everything. Ask yourself a simple and absolutely obvious question. Is it possible to host the head of a foreign state there? Could Putin meet Trump in Kamchatka? No, he could not. There simply is no level of hotels capable of accommodating such a high-ranking foreign guest. Could he be received in Alaska? There are countless places. Not one, not two, not 10. That is the difference. And when the Russian government says that it is ready to reconsider the treaty and take Alaska back, I have one question. What exactly would they do with it? Will they turn this flourishing land into the dump that the rest of Siberia and Kamchatka have become? Why would they want to ruin yet another territory? I am not even touching on the legality or the absurdity of the claim itself. But even if we were to take it at face value for a moment, why? In exactly the same way, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, it left blooming greenhouses and flourishing orchards to the locals, and they were destroyed. Why destroy a beautiful civilization? We have two different civilizations, the American one, which creates, and the Russian one, which destroys. And now, having destroyed Ukraine, Russia dreams of destroying Alaska as well. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, come. We will see how that works out for you. Goodbye, and see you next time.